The last part of our discussion of the environmental protection framework, I want to talk about application to other resource values in the Lake Town Township study area. The first of these is aggregate resource value. As I indicated at the beginning of the lecture, there are in the southern part of the study area, down along the Minnesota River, especially in the Minnesota River floodplain, there are significant, very significant sand and gravel resources that are basically sitting very close to the surface of the landscape, because when the river was a glacial river Warren draining Lake Agassiz from the northwestern part of the state and Canada, water was coursing through here very, very rapidly, deposited very significant sand and gravel deposits, and they're very close to the surface. So they're very easily extractable, and they're very valuable for home construction, for highway construction, other forms of construction. So part of what we're going to look at is where are these significant aggregate resource values located in the landscape. Second thing is looking at significant recreational values. With all of the lakes that we have in the study area, you can imagine that there's a significant amount of recreation that occurs, both on Lake Waconia and also on many of the smaller lakes. These include the boat launch areas, they include swimming facilities, they include parks. In the upper left-hand slide, you see the brown area in the upper right-hand corner of the left slide. That's the Carver Park Reserve, very, very large, one of the largest, three largest park reserves in the metropolitan area. There are several other local and county park reserves in the study area as well. So we'll be looking at these institutional open space areas, water access sites, water-oriented recreation, and snowmobile trails. We'll also be looking at kind of putting those together to come up with a significant recreational value map. And obviously, in terms of future development, these are areas, and especially the areas around them, where we want to take especially careful attention to the recreational value of the landscape and not disrupt that with future development patterns. The open space resources in terms of things like National Wildlife Refuge, the Department of Interior has a very large wildlife refuge along the Minnesota River, the Carver Park Reserve, several other kinds of open space resources exist throughout the study area. We obviously don't want to impact those as well. There are many historic and archaeological values in the landscape. All of the purple dots that you see on this image are historic structures that have more or less historic value associated with them. And I've buffered them each by by 30 meters, basically extending the zone of influence out into the landscape to give us a sense of that portion of the landscape that has some historic value. And then we see significant archaeological values. These are sections of land in the public land survey system that are known to contain various kinds and quantities of archaeological resource. The last thing I want to talk about is mapping scenic values in the landscape. And in mapping scenic values in the landscape, we'll be using GIS in order to predict what kinds of values would be associated with the landscape in terms of scenic value. And what I'm going to talk about is based upon principles of empirical studies that have looked at the ways in which different people perceive scenic value in the landscape. There are two sets of principles associated with scenic value in the landscape. We have principles that are associated with surface water, landscapes associated with surface water expressed in lakes, streams, and wetlands tend to be higher in scenic value. Landscapes associated with historically significant features are regarded as scenic. Landscapes associated with agricultural uses, grasslands, and forests are associated as scenic. And generally speaking, landscapes associated with intensive development are tended to be regarded as being of lower scenic value. So we can use these principles based upon the empirical research that I talked about to identify landscapes that contain steeper slopes as being regarded as scenic value, landscapes that have irregular or convoluted surfaces being perceived as scenic, and landscapes containing edges between undeveloped land uses and forested land uses are regarded as scenic. So we can take these land cover principles and these slope principles and begin to identify and map scenic values in the landscape. For example, we can assign different levels of attractiveness. On the right-hand slope assigns values from 0 to 10 to different degrees of slope. The steeper the slope, the higher the scenic value. We can do the same to different classes of land cover. The bottomland forest, upland forest, water, and wetland have the highest attractiveness value, followed by grassland, oak savanna openings, shrublands, cropland, etc., all the way down to areas that have varying percents of development intensity. So we can identify scenic value associated with the land cover type. We can identify scenic value associated with proximity to historic structures. We can identify scenic value associated with proximity to water features. Remember, water features are important. Landscapes adjacent to water features are important. We can combine these 4 different types of values to come up with a significant scenic value map that allows us to identify, based upon empirical work, while we have not conducted empirical research ourselves, the modeling that we're doing, the scenic modeling, the spatial modeling of scenic value that we're doing is based upon literature that's been published from actual empirical studies of how people perceive different kinds of landscapes. So this is the last of the resource values then that we'll be looking at in the landscape study area to try to identify scenic value associated with the land form, the slope of the landscape, and with land cover conditions. Thank you very much.